A woman in red high heels with long, wet hair, a female student who buys light bulbs every evening, and a mysterious woman with a suitcase sitting at the bus stop, waiting to be taken home. The song of a boy in a dark alley never ceases, and an unnamed old man drowns the elevator in tears. Strange people frequently visit the lighting store, and a sunglass-wearing owner warns everyone. Do you know? There are many strange people and things in the world. When faced with such situations, the best solution is to pretend you haven't noticed anything. One day, office worker A. Jun dozed off on the bus, but soon he was awakened by the announcement of the next stop. A. Jun hurriedly got up and got off the bus, where a strange woman sat at the isolated stop. A. Jun didn't think much of it and quickly walked home. The next day, he saw the woman in white again, sitting in the same spot with a suitcase beside her. As A. Jun felt puzzled, the woman in white suddenly tapped the long bench with her nails. This incident had been bothering A. Jun. On the third day, he mustered the courage to speak to the woman in white. A. Jun explained that the last bus had just left, so it would be better for her to call a taxi directly. The woman in white blankly replied, "I lost my phone." Upon hearing this, A. Jun wanted to lend her his phone, but he noticed that the screen of his phone was cracked. Fortunately, it didn't affect making calls.
모르겠어요.
저희 구면인가요?
The woman lowered her head and refused to speak further, and A. Jun put away his phone and left. On the fourth day, it rained heavily in the evening, and the woman was actually sitting in the rain waiting. A. Jun felt that they had seen each other for 4 consecutive days, and also had a conversation. He couldn't just watch her get drenched in the rain, so he decided to lend his umbrella to the woman in white. He ran home to get it, and when the woman heard him say he lived nearby, she surprisingly wanted to go back home with A. Jun. After saying this, she dragged her suitcase forward, and A. Jun took the woman in white back to his apartment. He unlocked the door and prepared to enter and turn on the lights.
주세요.
As the woman in white walked in with her suitcase, the door slammed shut with a bang, and the scene shifted to a university-affiliated hospital, where a strange aura approached the intensive care unit. The team leader saw a shadow flash by. She took out some eye drops and placed a drop in her eye. The team leader occasionally saw shadows, and thought it was floaters, so she went to see a doctor. But nothing conclusive was found. The nurse beside her couldn't help but complain that since coming to the intensive care unit, she had been experiencing tinnitus, and she kept hearing strange sounds. With such intense late-night shifts, it would eventually take a toll on their health. They discussed going out for cup noodles, but the team leader has to guard the surveillance and emergency call, so she could leave. Yang Ji suddenly spoke up, saying that she was responsible for the intensive care unit and couldn't leave, and that she could help watch the monitors. Yang Ji urged the team leader to go eat with everyone, and soon after the nurses left, an old man began to loiter outside the intensive care unit. Yang Ji quickly got up to remind him that outsiders were not allowed to enter here. Even for visiting patients, prior approval was required.
영안실이 어디예요?
The nurses ran over to see, and found that an oxygen tube had fallen. The team leader's face showed anger, and she called over Nurse Park, who was responsible for Bed B1, for a talk. By the time Yang Ji remembered the old man, he had already disappeared. At this moment, the strange old man walked into a lighting store that specialized in selling lamps. The store manager, Yin-Yang, asked, "What would you like to buy?" The old man glanced at him, and left the store without saying a word. Soon after, a female customer entered the store to buy light tubes, and she couldn't help but complain. "I didn't even know this store existed during the day, but at night, your store is the only one that has lights on." Yin-Yang explained that they only operated at night, and after sending the female customer off, a man with a tight-fitting coat and bangs barged in. He had just frozen to death at home, and even with the electric blanket on, he could still see his breath. Moreover, there was always a dog barking wildly outside, and he irritably walked out onto the street. The man saw the lighting store glowing warmly, and he couldn't help but walk inside.
아무거나 손대지 마시고요.
The man with bangs awkwardly retracted his hand, and asked Yin-Yang if he had seen a dog. "If I catch it, it's doomed," he said. After saying this, the man cursed and left. Yin-Yang thoughtfully looked out the window. It was unexpectedly raining tonight, when suddenly, thunder rumbled. The students in evening classes were startled, and the 4 girls used the stormy atmosphere to gather together, and share ghost stories about their school. It was said that there was a student no one recognized, who had mixed into their school. People occasionally saw her, but no one knew which class she belonged to. And aren't there empty desks in every classroom?
그의 자리래.
야,
The chubby girl said seriously. When you look at graduation photos or group pictures, don't you ever find someone you can't remember at all? Finally, the evening class ended, and the four girls headed home together. The chubby girl suddenly stopped in the middle of the road, looking towards a dim alleyway. It was said that at night, someone would wander here, and strange singing could be heard. Hyunju scoffed, saying it couldn't be that mysterious. I often walk this path to buy things for my mom. The other three girls became more frightened as they thought about it, and they pushed each other while screaming as they ran away. Hyunju took a deep breath and entered the alley, as she was going to buy light bulbs tonight. The dark alley had not a single light. Hyunju stared straight ahead and quickened her pace, but suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. Hyunju turned around and seemed to see a shadowy figure, and she ran terrified into the lighting store. Yin-Yang clearly knew this girl well, as she often came to buy light bulbs for her mom. Yin-Yang joked with Hyunju that she was already in high school, yet still wore a child's anti-loss necklace. Hyunju replied that it was a gift from her father when she was little, and now he was working abroad, making it hard for the family to reunite. Hyunju asked Yin-Yang why he wore sunglasses in the store, and he explained that the lighting was too bright here, and he was afraid of damaging his eyes.
힘드시겠다. 그래도 저는 얼마나 다행인지 몰라요. 아니 진짜 아저씨 가게가 있으니까 여기 지나다니지. 이 앞에 골목길이 얼마나 깜깜한데요.
Hyunju quietly shared the ghost story told by the chubby girl, and Yin-Yang advised her not to scare herself. Upon hearing this, Hyunju retorted, I really saw someone in the alley just now. Yin-Yang's expression changed at her words, and he warned Hyunju that if she saw a strange person, she must pretend not to notice anything unusual. I have been here for a long time, operating from midnight until sunrise every day. At night, all kinds of people come in, most of whom are ordinary, but there are also strange people mixed in with the crowd. You must observe carefully to notice them.
나 되게 발레. 그들은 어딘가 뭔가 달라. 눈치채지 못할 뿐이야.
Yin-Yang stopped the topic, fearing to frighten Hyunju, and he gave her a hand-cranked flashlight to help her light the way at night. Meanwhile, A-Jun, who was taking the stranger home, finally noticed something strange about the woman in white. Her nails were actually growing on her fingertips. The woman laid the suitcase down and unzipped it, revealing a complete set of scissors inside. Soon after, Hyunju returned to the 8th floor of her apartment, and she brushed past the woman in white with the suitcase. It turned out that Hyunju lived next door to A-Jun, but she didn't notice the blood seeping from the suitcase. The scene shifted back to the dark alley, where a girl named Shanhai was planning to rent a place. She disliked living in an apartment and dealing with neighbors, so she had her eye on a certain room in the alley. The landlord said that the surrounding houses were empty, and it was absolutely quiet with no disturbances. The first floor windows were also reinforced with iron bars, ensuring the safety of the tenants. Shanhai carefully checked each room, but she found that one of the rooms was locked. The landlord explained that it was locked for repairs.
아니 그렇다고 이렇게 방문을 잠가놓으면 어떡해요.
그 조건이라 보증금이 싼 거야.
Shanhai had a limited budget but high expectations, and this was the only place that suited her. So she quickly moved in, and did a thorough cleaning and organizing. Her cozy little home was tidily arranged, and in the evening, she turned off the lights and returned to her bedroom to write. Outside, the famous song Where the Wind Blows was playing, sung by a male student named Ji-hyung, who was singing with his eyes closed to muster courage. He was very afraid of this dark alley, but it was the only way to get home. Ji-hyung found that if he finished singing Where the Wind Blows, he would just have enough time to walk out of the alley. So he sang every time to boost his courage. Ji-hyung sang louder and louder, hoping to dispel his fear. When he finished the song, he finally saw the lighting store, which meant he was out of the alley. As the alley fell silent, Shanhai began to feel sleepy, so she didn't notice the eerie shadow behind her, or the woman standing at the door. In the blink of an eye, it's another day.
비 오니까 더 무섭네.
At the same time, Shanhai was at home reading, when suddenly, the light above her went out. No wonder the alley was always so dark. Could it be that here, at a certain hour, the light bulbs all malfunctioned? Ji-hyung was humming a tune as he walked, when he saw a female student ahead. As soon as she saw him, he ran away in fright. So the shadow Hyunju saw was very likely Ji-hyung. Shanhai heard the familiar song begin to play, and she looked out the window in silence. The next second, the bedroom light also went out, and she was about to curse this broken house, when she saw light coming from the locked door. Her breathing became heavier in an instant. Shanhai cautiously walked over and grasped the doorknob, but to her surprise, she easily pushed the door open. Inside, there was only a very bright light bulb.
얘, 너였니?
Ji-hyung didn't know what he had seen, and scared, he ran away while still humming the song. On the other side, the evening class at the girls' high school had ended, and everyone quickly fled the classroom. Hyunju's deskmate, Motasaka, was still asleep, and she tried to wake her up. Motasaka mumbled, "Let me sleep for another 10 minutes. But when Hyunju couldn't wake her, she simply left. That night, she had to pass through the frightening alley again. But unexpectedly, halfway through, she saw a woman. Hyunju shook her flashlight, illuminating the woman's red high heels and black long hair. Hyunju stepped forward to hold the umbrella for the woman, thinking that it was nice to have someone to walk out of the alley with. Suddenly, the woman's black hair fell down, and Hyunju remembered Yin-Yang's warning, to try to ignore her abnormalities. But the next second, the long-haired woman's ankle was as flexible as a noodle. Hyunju tried to stay calm and said, "My mom is calling me home for dinner. I have to go now." She quickly pulled away but couldn't help turning back. And Yin-Yang saw Hyunju running toward him. He told her to go home and find her mom first. Then he faced the strange woman and took off his glasses. When she saw this, she turned and returned to the alley, while Ji-hyung was still in the alley, and he encountered the woman in white with the suitcase. Ji-hyung had finally met someone, and he took the initiative to hold the umbrella for the woman in white. Ji-hyung said that as long as they reached the lighting store, they would be able to safely leave the alley. "If you don't mind, can you walk with me?"
이곳에 혼자 왔냐고.
네, 혼자죠.
At the same time, Shanhai was taking a shower with a flashlight. Her short hair was growing wildly like seaweed, but Shanhai was completely unaware. It wasn't until she was drying her hair that she noticed the long hair in the drain. This definitely wasn't her hair. Shanhai took the flashlight to check the room, when suddenly, the bathroom door slammed shut behind her, and the light bulb in the storage room lit up again. Ji-hyung happened to pass by Shanhai's door, and he couldn't help but tell the woman in white that this alley used to be very dark, but for some unknown reason, this household had always been lit up. One day, a short-haired girl suddenly opened the window and talked to me, and behind her stood a very tall woman. No wonder Ji-hyung ran away that day. At this moment, Shanhai glanced at the mirror, and she finally saw the eerie woman. It turned out that there had always been a stranger in this house.
집안에 불이 꺼지는 이유는 그것이 어둠 속에 숨기 위함이었다.
The woman in white insisted on barging in to ask if the two women knew each other. Ji-hyung wanted to grab her, but he noticed that she had reversed nails.
너도 나하고 크게 다르지 않아.
Following her gaze, Ji-hyung discovered that his own feet were reversed. He didn't know when it had happened, but he had been trapped in this alley, unable to escape forever. And Shanhai was also trapped in her residence, unable to leave. In the dark of night, there were only two desperate souls, and the flickering light. On the other side, Motasaka was awakened by the thunder, and she was about to pack up and leave the classroom. But Motasaka discovered that a girl was sitting in the empty seat, in a world filled with ghosts on this stormy night. Inside the university hospital, the attending physician was still making rounds in the intensive care unit. The condition of a female patient was not optimistic, and the hospital had done all it could. Now, they could only look at her will to survive. In the next bed was a patient with alcohol poisoning, who had been transferred here due to a lack of beds outside. He kept talking in his sleep, suffering from severe delirium, and the doctor was worried it would disturb the rest of the other patients. He asked the team leader to quickly free up a bed and move him. After completing the rounds, the doctor went to inform the family of the female patient, and the family was in tears, struggling to accept the reality. Although Yang-ji had been a nurse for quite some time, she still couldn't bear to see such a scene. Yang-ji hid in a bathroom stall to calm her emotions, but unexpectedly, the patient's family followed her in to press for answers. "You doctors always say it depends on the patient's will to survive. But how can unconscious critically ill patients develop willpower?" This was Yang-ji's first encounter with such a situation, and she could only comfort them through the door. Yang-ji had also lost consciousness in a serious accident before, and at that time, the doctor had told her mother the same thing. The elderly woman could only pray by her daughter's side every night, hoping to instill her will into Yang Ji. Eventually, she really pulled through. So Yang Ji wanted to tell the family member to never give up hope. The other party began to knock loudly on the door. Fortunately, the cleaning lady interrupted the terrifying illusion. With multiple storylines still unfolding, new characters quickly made their appearance. The time shifted back to a month ago. The girl living alone Kyungmin was lying in her room watching TV. She heard the sound of a key turning in the lock outside, and Kyungmin quickly turned off the light to check. However, the sounds outside had not yet faded. And after the locking sound faded, Kyungmin opened the door to confirm. It's important to note here that there were signs of sparks and burning. In the corridor of Kyungmin's apartment, behind the dim window, glowing eyes appeared, and the scene shifted to a strange detective appearing. He was chasing a hooded man, and entered a bus heading to Gangneung. He then dispersed the other passengers, revealing that the hooded man was an arsonist. He had burned a girl on the third floor of the Kian-Hodong apartment building to death. Just as the detective was about to make the arrest, the hooded man stared ahead, because he saw a girl, Kyungmin, who should have died long ago. Remembered that the corridor of Kyungmin's apartment was covered in burn marks, and it seemed she was avoiding a stalker? We can speculate that Kyungmin was already burned to death by the hooded man, and that her soul remained in the apartment. What exactly happened between the new characters? Let's continue to find out. The detective handed the criminal over to the responsible officer, and he tried to smoke but couldn't get the lighter to ignite. His hands were inexplicably covered in black stains, and he quickly returned to the police station. On his desk was a photo of a girl, who resembled the mysterious girl Motasaka had seen in the empty seat after waking up. The detective opened the report on the Kian-Hodong arson case, and the deceased listed was indeed Kyungmin. Since the criminal had already been captured, he placed the case file into the completed drawer. Inside, there was also a murder report from the Maesong apartment in the Gangdong district. Then the detective oiled his lighter, but even when filled, it wouldn't ignite. Nothing seemed to be going right. Just then, a young officer brought a document reporting on the elderly murder case in the Yanjidong area. He had just finished talking with the witness, Kim Sang-hoon, and after initial investigations, it was determined that the elderly man had died suddenly from a stroke. The detective casually stuffed the file into the case-closed drawer, planning to head to a nearby Chinese restaurant for a meal. As he passed through Yanjidong, he turned his steps to check out the crime scene. There were no police tape at the entrance, just two officers.
거의 전 뺐네. 네. 아, 진짜 신기하네. 얼마 전 방화 사건 지원 나갔다가 스치듯 뺐는데.
The detective was known for his strong memory. In theory, someone like him should have excellent results in solving cases, but he was too fixated on details, and once he focused on a suspect, even closed cases could become open again. He wouldn't rest until all suspicions were eliminated. So, while his arrest rate was high, his actual performance was quite low. As the detective was about to enter, he noticed a black mark on the floor. The deceased remained seated in the living room as he was. He was an elderly person living alone. His children were all abroad, and his spouse passed away early. The detective stared at the deceased for a while, and couldn't help but ask if it was a heart attack. Shouldn't he be clutching his chest in pain? Why did the deceased look so peaceful? The officer nearby explained that it might not be acute. Anyway, the autopsy report would be out soon. Moreover, there were indeed cardiovascular medications in the deceased's home. For some reason, the detective felt he had seen this expression somewhere before. He opened the elderly man's phone to check, and found he had spoken to his son and daughter before his death. The detective picked up the remote and started fiddling with it, while the nearby officer turned on the TV. He discovered that the replay function was activated, and it had played a program from 2018. However, only the channel button showed signs of wear, indicating that the elderly man didn't have a habit of using the replay function. This case was probably not that simple. In the evening, the detective returned home, and in the bathroom cabinet, there were still his wife's sanitary pads. The image of her happily announcing her pregnancy was still etched in the detective's mind, but everything had changed, and this home felt devoid of warmth. The next morning, the detective finally had some zhajiangmian, and he touched the sauce stains on his. He glanced again at the mark left by the photo frame. and hurriedly put down his bowl to return to the station. He called an officer to his side.
저 사건은 저번에 범인 잡았잖아요.
피해자를 못 찾았잖아.
The detective reviewed the autopsy report that had just arrived, as the family didn't wish for an autopsy to be conducted, so the coroner could only draw blood, to confirm the troponin levels, and combined it with the deceased's past medical records, to determine that the cause of death was an acute myocardial infarction. The police stated that this was sufficient to close the case, but the detective sought out the technical staff to pull up a map of the elderly man's location. He then marked all the Chinese restaurants that sold Zhejiangmian. After noting the locations, he left, while an officer came over with coffee, trying to curry favor with the female officer. There was a close-up of the female officer's hand, showing a scar resembling a burn on her palm. The scene shifted back to the detective, who had run around to various Chinese restaurants. Either they didn't deliver, or they couldn't deliver to such a far distance from the deceased's home. The detective had been investigating, until nightfall without any leads, until he passed by a rundown noodle shop. It reminded him that besides Chinese restaurants, noodle shops also sold Zhejiangmian. The detective noticed that the delivery bike at the entrance was covered in mud, and it had rained heavily the night before the elderly man died. He entered the shop and ordered a bowl of Zhejiangmian, and behind the small door curtain, only the owner was busy. The detective recognized him as the witness Kim Sang-hoon, so he quietly observed his surroundings. Sure enough, he found a delivery thermal box, which resembled the black marks at the deceased's door. The Zhejiangmian was quickly cooked, and the detective started talking to Kim Sang-hoon as he ate. "I see you don't have a food delivery app set up either, and the ordering phone at the entrance is incomplete. What would you do if someone wanted to order takeout?" Kim Sang-hoon explained that the customers were all regulars, and they always found a way to contact him. The detective had checked the elderly man's phone, and he had definitely not placed any orders.
주문을 안 했는데도 갔네.
The detective wiped his mouth, and began to elaborate on the doubts of the case. First, the deceased's expression was unnatural, and the TV's replay function was suspicious. Next, there was an issue with the placement of the remote control. The elderly man was right-handed, yet the remote was on his left side. This indicated that an outsider must have been there, and the black square marks left at the door reminded the detective of the Zhejiangmian delivery box. This could explain the black spot at the corner of the elderly man's mouth. He initially thought it was an age spot, but later realized it was leftover sauce.
대체 무슨 말씀을 하시는 건지 전혀 모르겠는데요.
모른다.
한 말 안 해.
Kim Sang-hoon was sure that the detective had no evidence, so he didn't admit anything. The detective warned him not to be too complacent. There is no perfect crime in this world. I will find the evidence sooner or later. After returning to the police station, he pulled out a stack of natural death cases. He believed that the elderly man in Yeonjadong was definitely not the first victim. A month passed in the blink of an eye, and while surveilling Kim Sang-hoon, he saved a woman who was being chased.
저기 아저씨, 괜찮으세요?
When the woman in front got up, the detective realized that she was actually Kyung Min. Combined with what Kim Sang-hoon had just said, it seemed that both he and the detective had the ability to see the dead. Kim Sang-hoon said, "That woman can't be here." Then he was about to chase after her. The detective thought he was trying to run away, and immediately knocked Kim Sang-hoon to the ground. A car's headlights shone through, and his eyes turned into eerie vertical slits. The detective then walked into a lighting store and said he had lost track of a suspect nearby. He then described the general characteristics, and asked Won Ryong if he had seen him. Coincidentally, the woman in white with the suitcase was also there, and upon hearing the detective's identity, she prepared to leave. However, the bloodstains on the ground caught her attention. The detective called out to the woman in white and asked, "Miss, are you hurt?"
몸이 안 좋은 날이에요.
Upon hearing her response, the detective stopped pressing for details, and instead took off his raincoat to give it to her to shield from the rain. The woman in white left while dragging her suitcase, and she encountered Hyunju, who was rushing by. Meanwhile, the detective in the lighting store noted the flickering light bulbs, which reminded him of the broken lamp on his desk. This store always gave him a strange feeling. The detective continued to question Won Ryong, emphasizing that as soon as the suspect came into bright light, he would shrink into vertical slits like a cat's eyes. Won Ryong calmly ignored the detective's oddities, suggesting that he wait a bit longer in the store. It was pouring rain outside, and the nearby shops had all closed. If the suspect hadn't gone far, he might just come by to seek shelter from the rain. Let's pause the situation here and return to Nurse Yong-ji. She drove into the underground parking lot of the hospital, and along the way, she saw mourners in funeral attire outside a funeral home. It turned out that near the emergency medical center, there was also a funeral home. At this moment, 2 morticians were handling a corpse, because there were minor flaws on the coffin, and they prepared to change the deceased into a burial garment first, before sending her to the morgue for storage. While the female assistant was handling the corpse, the deceased suddenly let out a sigh. The mortician explained that this was the sound of gas escaping from the deceased's body. He then stuffed a few pieces of clean cotton into the corpse's mouth, to ensure that the gas wouldn't escape. Afterward, the two helped the deceased change clothes, and the mortician instructed the assistant to contact the family. He stayed behind to trim the deceased's nails.
난 죽은 건가요?
네.
이렇게 죽으면 안 돼요.
Seemingly accustomed to such situations, he placed the deceased into the cold storage, and advised her not to cling to unfinished matters. You will soon forget all your memories here, and feel comfortable and at peace. However, the deceased became unusually agitated, saying she didn't want to forget her beloved daughter. Everyone can guess who this daughter might be. At this moment, the mortician closed the cabinet, and the label read the deceased's information. Zhang Weishi, female, 52 years old. At the same time, Yong-ji walked into the staff elevator, and a soaked man, wearing a refrigerated truck uniform, also entered the elevator. Both were heading to the 8th floor. The 8th floor only had the intensive care unit and the isolation ward, so Yong-ji reminded the man that visitors were not allowed at night. The man showed a pained expression, as if he was very concerned about whether the critically ill patient could wake up. He broke down, starting to cry, and the water on him started to increase, even pooling at Yong-ji's feet. As the water threatened to rise above her head, Yong-ji felt a wave of suffocation. Fortunately, the elevator soon stopped at the 8th floor, and when she looked back, the oddity had disappeared. Yong-ji often saw strange people, so she likely also had the ability to see the dead. At this moment, the team leader called out to Yong-ji, saying, 2 new accident victims have arrived, one of whom is in critical condition, and has been sent to the first treatment area for emergency care. The nurse couldn't help but complain about the recent major accident that had caused a shortage of beds in the ICU. The alcoholic man is getting better, and I really want to transfer him out quickly. Following the conventions of a suspense horror film, the bizarre encounters of introduced characters were likely related to this major accident. After hesitating, Yong-ji asked the team leader, as she wanted to take charge of transferring the alcoholic patient. Yong-ji did this because the patient's mumblings were not coming from nowhere. It turned out that the alcoholic could also see wandering souls. Yong-ji brushed aside her hair to reveal a wound, as she had nearly died because of a drunk driver. After waking up, Yong-ji gained the ability to see the dead, but the deceased were very similar to ordinary people. Yong-ji sometimes found it confusing. In addition to the dead, there were also souls lingering on the edge of life and death. It's important to note that the ICU is a place where life and death intersect, where you can see many patients struggling between the two realms. Yong-ji explained that the person the alcoholic saw was the man who had asked for the location of the morgue that day. He was deeply in debt, and had been buried alive for failing to repay a loan shark. After being rescued, he fell into a coma, and he worried that if he didn't die, he would become a burden to his family. That's why he asked where the morgue was. Yong-ji believed the patient's will to live could save him, so she helped him clear the sand from his ears. Yong-ji urged him to hang in there and live, and she emulated her team leader from years ago, playing music for these comatose patients. The song playing in the headphones was Where the Wind Blows. Right now, Yong-ji said this to the alcoholic to remind him that, since you can see people on the edge of life and death, it indicates that the boundaries within you are also becoming blurred. So don't drink anymore, and live well. On the other side, Hyunju was on her way home from school, when she was unexpectedly stopped by the woman in white.
전구 사러 왔니?
네.
어제도 사지 않았어?
Who would come every day to buy light bulbs? Hyunju's situation must be complicated. She hurried home, but Hyunju saw the frost-covered man with bangs. He was still looking for his dog in a nearby park. Hyunju ignored the oddities about him, and ran back to the apartment in one breath. Suddenly, the sound of the electrocardiogram machine came from the void. The man with bangs, Tenant Shanhei, and Ji Hyung, who could never leave the alley, all heard this faint sound. It turned out they were all lying in the ICU, with the song Where the Wind Blows playing in their ears. The nurse continued her rounds with a medical record book, and soon arrived at Ah-jun's bedside. Lying next to him was the patrol officer. At the same time, Hyunju burst into her home, and the room was pitch dark. The trash can was full of light bulbs, and her mother had been silent for some time, because when she opened her mouth, the cotton inside would be revealed.
근데 엄마한테서 좋은 냄새 난다. 꽃 냄새 나.
The deceased Zhang Weishi was Hyunju's mother. The scene shifted to the woman in white leaning outside the door, curious if the mother and daughter still remembered each other. According to research findings so far, about 4% to 18% of those who were revived from cardiac arrest claim to have had near-death experiences. Several common points emerge in their testimonies. They all saw a bright light when near death, as well as a dark tunnel and loved ones. On this stormy night, a fateful last bus was about to depart. Driver Wu was on the phone with the bus station. The 362 bus he often drives has a strange noise at the tire. It's likely that there's a problem with the brake pads or linings, so he hoped the garage would send a spare vehicle over, but the higher-ups said it wasn't a big issue, and told him to make do. If he went to a nearby repair shop, instead of returning to the garage for inspection, he would have to pay for it himself. He wasn't financially well off, so he had to give up, and with the departure time approaching, Driver Wu had to start the bus. This dangerous bus had already chosen its passengers. First was the ordinary office worker, Ah-jun, who was supposed to go to his girlfriend's house to propose that night. He felt incredibly nervous along the way, as his mind was racing with thoughts. Not long after getting off the subway, he realized that he had left the bouquet on the bus. It was too late to go back now, and Ah-jun could only curse under his breath as he waited for the bus. A man by the bus stop was talking to his girlfriend, his tone intimate and natural. Ah-jun also took out his phone, but he didn't make a call. Instead, he used the voice-to-text function, clearly conveying word by word, "I'm at the bus stop right now, and it's pouring rain tonight. You don't need to come out to wait for me later."
보고 싶어. 사랑해. 쪽.
Why didn't Ah-jun make a call, or send a voice message directly? Because his girlfriend, Ji-young, is deaf and mute, so they could only communicate through text on their phones. Ah-jun was unaware that his mother disapproved of Ji-young being deaf, and he had secretly met with her. She asked Ji-young not to be a burden on Ah-jun, which is why Ji-young was planning to leave without saying goodbye tonight. However, when she saw the message from Ah-jun, Ji-young felt a little soft-hearted. Today was actually Ji-young's birthday, and if she greedily wanted to see Ah-jun one more time, it shouldn't be too much to ask, right? At this moment, the 362 bus arrived at the second stop, and the splashing water soaked Ji-hyun's new sneakers. He cursed his bad luck as he tapped his car to board. Driver Wu noticed that the brakes were becoming more difficult to use, so he decided to turn on the service termination warning lights. He decided to take fewer passengers tonight. Now, let's return to the new passenger, Ji-young, who was just an ordinary high school student. He had just finished a basketball game with his friends tonight, and they teased Ji-young about his brand new sneakers. They playfully pushed each other, and agreed on the time for their next game. Driver Wu continued to drive the bus forward, when a short-haired woman by the roadside suddenly kicked a shoe into the middle of the road. In a panic, he quickly stopped the bus. The short-haired woman didn't see the warning lights, and she walked barefoot onto the bus. She seemed to have had an argument with the long-haired woman behind her. The long-haired woman picked up a red high heel and hurriedly followed. A few hours ago, these two women were looking at apartments in a nearby building, as they wanted to move in together. The short-haired woman Shan-hye was very satisfied with the new apartment, as it was near the subway and reasonably priced. But the long-haired woman Hui-yuan was not interested.
두 분 사실 충분해. 모녀신가?
Upon hearing this, Shan-hye lost interest in the apartment viewings. The two left wearing matching high heels, and they erupted into an argument halfway. It turned out that Shan-hye and Hui-yuan were partners, having bridged age and gender to understand and cherish each other. But compared to the young and brave Shan-hye, Hui-yuan had too many concerns. She didn't want to live in a crowded apartment, and she was even reluctant to cohabitate. In fact, Hui-yuan felt that the two shouldn't continue their relationship. She loved Shan-hye very much, so she didn't want to delay her.
내가 나이가 너무 많아서 그래. 모녀처럼 보여.
The bus continued to move forward. Hyunju and her mother hurried to flag it down, but driver Wu really didn't want to take on more passengers. He just wanted to return to the garage for repairs quickly. However, this mother and daughter duo chased after it in the pouring rain, so driver Wu had to stop. Sometimes, fate works that way. In fact, Hyunju was in a good mood today, because her mother had specially come to pick her up from school. Moreover, the family was about to move soon, and they would no longer have to cross this bridge. She curiously glanced around at the passengers nearby, who were quietly gazing out the window, not knowing what thoughts filled their minds. The bus soon entered the bridge, and the traffic was sparse in the evening. Hyunju boredly stared out the window. Even though driver Woo was using various emergency measures, trying his best to stabilize the vehicle to protect the passengers, but the truck driver behind was on the phone, and by the time he realized, he had already crashed into the bus. Route 362 lost control, and everyone was protecting their most cherished belongings. In the next moment, the bus crashed through the guardrail and plunged into the sea. This scene was just seen by Ji-young, who had come to pick up Ah-jun, and she anxiously called her boyfriend, but there was no response on the other end. Ji-young then called the police. She ran desperately toward the bridge, while inside the closed bus compartment, Ji-hyung was the first to regain consciousness. He handed the basketball to the only child in the bus, and then he forcefully pushed the child toward the shattered window. After that, he lost consciousness. Not long after, all the victims were sent to the hospital. Ji-hyung had a fractured left leg, and his brand new sneakers were deformed. Ah-jun had completely broken his waist due to the impact. Driver Woo's abdomen was filled with seawater, and his belly was swollen like that of a pregnant woman. Nurse Young-ji was busy assisting the doctors with emergency care, and she couldn't attend to other patients at all. So Young-ji asked a patient with chest pain to wait a moment. In short, the entire hospital was in chaos. Ji-young followed the police car all the way, and her world was silent. Ji-young could only see the emergency department, and everyone was very busy. Ji-young didn't dare to approach and disturb them. On the other side, the families of the patients waited in the waiting area, anxiously waiting for the doctor's verdict.
오승원님 보호자분. 오승원님 2018년 9월 11일 7시 5분에 임종하셨습니다.
Driver Woo was pronounced dead after unsuccessful resuscitation, followed closely by the unconscious Ji-hyung, and Hyunju being rolled in. From here, it was clear to see Hyunju's father in mourning attire. Since Hyunju was still alive, it meant that his wife Jang Weishi had been declared dead. Then the doctor wheeled in a body, and Ah-jun's parents felt their hearts leap to their throats. They inquired and learned that the deceased was Park Hui-yuan. Yet somehow, no family members had come. At this moment, a police officer approached the couple and said, "We found Ah-jun's phone." Coincidentally, Ji-young, worried, had just called Ah-jun. Ah-jun's mother immediately replied, "My son is dead because he saw you die." Just after sending the message, Ah-jun was wheeled out, and he still had vital signs. After calming down, Ah-jun's father asked his wife to text Ji-young for clarification. "No matter how dissatisfied you are with this girl, you shouldn't joke about such matters." He had just opened his son's phone, and saw Ji-young's message, "I'm going to the place where you are." They hurriedly sent a message saying Ah-jun was still alive. Unaware that Ji-young's feet were already off the ground, she saw a message pop up on her phone. The text preview said Ah-jun was still alive. Ji-young desperately scratched at the rope around her neck, until she had pulled off all her nails. Finally, Ji-young could only die with deep regret, while those in a coma were at a critical stage.
그들은 어두운 터널을 보았다고 주장한다. 그들은 밝은 빛을 보았다고 주장한다. 그들은 사랑하는 사람을 다시 만났다고 주장한다.
At this point, the story finally became clear. After Ji-young died, her body was sent to the funeral home. Korea follows the tradition of a 3-day funeral. The body is kept for 3 days before being cremated, because it's not just the living who need time to say goodbye. The deceased also need time to bid farewell. For Ji-young, saying goodbye was invaluable, so she waited by the bus stop that Ah-jun would pass after work. Ji-young appeared just as she did in life, but the nails that had fallen off had grown to her fingertips. She anxiously tapped on the bench. Ji-young was surprised to find that she could actually hear the sound. She immediately tried to speak,
나도 보고 싶어.
which was a message she hadn't sent, the last words she wanted to tell her loved one. However, when Ah-jun got off the bus, he completely ignored her. Ah-jun had actually forgotten Ji-young, and due to his fractured waist, his soul couldn't stay active for long. That night, 2 estate handlers came to sort out Ji-young's leather workshop, because the manager was eager to reclaim the space. One of the older handlers noticed the lit room inside, and realized that the owner might not have left yet. Those in this line of work must have keen insight. so the handler hurriedly pulled his partner to leave first. In the silent workshop, only light seeped from the inner room. Ji-young had stitched up the injured Ah-jun. However, his soul was trapped on the last bus, and every night he would return to take the bus. She could only wait, dragging his suitcase, and once Ah-jun collapsed due to his fracture, Ji-young would put him in the suitcase and drag him away, then find a place to stitch him up again. But no matter how Ji-young tried, Ah-jun could not remember her existence. Ji-young could only encounter him over and over, stitching him up again and again. 3 days for saying goodbye was simply not enough. That day, an assistant at the funeral home was about to start the embalming, when he discovered that the freezer door wouldn't open.
한이 많으신가 보다. 기다려보자.
In the evening, Hyun-ju, unaware that she was on the brink of death, was going home from school as usual. She happened to ride the same elevator as Ah-jun, and Hyun-ju noticed that his waist was covered in blood. She felt extremely frightened, fearing that he might be a psychopathic killer. Fortunately, Ah-jun bypassed Hyun-ju and opened the password lock of the neighboring room. It turned out he was just a neighbor. Just as Hyun-ju was about to breathe a sigh of relief, Ah-jun suddenly collapsed in half, falling to the ground. Immediately afterward, Ji-young came over, dragging his suitcase, and she hurriedly stuffed him into the suitcase. Hyun-ju was almost scared to death upon seeing this scene. Her mother stepped forward to signal her to stay silent.
둘은 서로를 기억하네요.
And Hyun-ju simply couldn't understand. In similar circumstances, why did Zhang Weishi remember her daughter, while Ah-jun had forgotten her? Hyun-ju couldn't comprehend what Ji-young meant, as she had encountered too many strange events in the past few days, and her emotions were starting to unravel. Moreover, her mother had been unwilling to speak, and kept asking her to buy light bulbs every night.
나 이제 조명가게 못 가. 거기 가는 길 무서워서 나 못 가겠다고, 엄마.
Hyun-ju really didn't know what to do. Her mother wouldn't speak, and her father was away on a business trip. Even the people at school ignored her. Poor Hyun-ju had no idea that her classmates ignored her, because ordinary people couldn't see souls at all. Zhang Weishi didn't know how to tell her daughter the truth, and Ji-young didn't know how to awaken Ah-jun's memory. She could only go to the hospital and cry by the bedside, while Young-ji, who had the ability to see spirits, knew she couldn't intervene casually, but she couldn't help but approach, pretending to talk to the unconscious Ah-jun. The hospital had done its best, and from now on, what mattered was the patient's will. Although I don't know where that so-called will comes from, I can be sure that the will of others can also help the deceased.
어떤 힘으로 계속 이렇게 연명하는지 참 불가사의하구만.
저거는 이게 설명하기가 어렵네요.
It turned out that every time Ji-young stitched, she was helping Ah-jun fight against death. If it weren't for her, he would have died long ago. Meanwhile, let's shift the focus to Shan-hae, who, after realizing she couldn't escape the rental apartment, had been hiding in the wardrobe and not coming out. However, she discovered a hospital gown for the university-affiliated hospital in the closet. Gathering her courage, Shan-hae pushed open the door, and the flickering light bulb overhead was like a beacon guiding souls back to life. Finally, Shan-hae remembered, the terrifying long-haired woman in the room was the person she loved most in this world. When the accident occurred, Hui Yuan had hugged Shan-hae from behind to protect her. The doctors couldn't pry Hui Yuan's stiff hands apart, and it was because she absorbed most of the impact that Shan-hae's life was saved. Thus, after Hui Yuan died, she still lay over Shan-hae. She wanted to continue protecting her loved one. Meanwhile, in the lighting store, Yin-Yang was chatting with a detective seeking shelter from the rain. Upon seeing Ji-young, the detective could sense that she was different from ordinary people. This kind of perceptiveness was quite rare, which piqued Yin-Yang's interest. The detective was equally curious about him. Due to his profession, detectives could generally infer rough information about strangers, but he couldn't see through Yin-Yang's age.
딸이 있었죠. 손님은 아이가 있으십니까?
있었어요.
Before the child was born, the detective and his wife had already given her many names. They originally planned to name the baby Sunlight, but unfortunately, the family never got to meet her, as the child was lost. The detective was busy with work at the time, and his wife mentioned that something felt off with her pregnancy, but he didn't take it seriously. It wasn't until 4 months later that he learned of the miscarriage. By this time, the heavy rain had stopped, and the detective stood up to take his leave and continue the pursuit of the criminal. He followed the motorcycle tracks to Sunlight Girls High School and ran into Hyunju's classroom. There were names of the classmates posted on the lockers: Most High, Baby, Wish, and Love. Do you find these names strange? Because these were all names given by the detective and his wife for their child. Even the name of the high school, Sunlight, was the final chosen name by his wife. The detective hurriedly left the girls' high school but he stumbled and fell hard, and his eyes went out of their sockets again. The detective pulled out his lighter, wanting to smoke to calm himself, but he unexpectedly found that it lit up, and the warm glow of the flame illuminated his shadow. It was clear that a part of the detective's head was missing. From this, we can infer that the detective had an accident while capturing the noodle shop owner, and his soul entered the boundary between life and death, because this world is relatively complete. Ji-Young, who was deaf and mute, became whole. The detective's malfunctioning lighter had also returned to normal. When he couldn't light it, it was the world of normal life. For an ordinary person, it might be hard to notice this, but the detective immediately ran back to the lighting store. He asked Yin-Yang for a cup of coffee.
이상했습니다. 뜨겁지도 않고 맛도 느껴지지 않고 여긴 조명 가게. 밤이 끝나지 않아요.
Yin-Yang finally waited for the first customer seeking answers. He took off his sunglasses, revealing cat-like vertical pupils. That year, the building where Yin-Yang lived collapsed, and he and his daughter were buried under the rubble. Yin-Yang was relatively lucky not to be trapped, but his daughter's leg was pinned by a huge stone. Yin-Yang tried his best but couldn't budge the stone even slightly. His daughter sweetly took out some candy, inviting her dad to eat with her. She said that once they finished eating, Daddy would be able to get up. Yin-Yang knew he couldn't delay any longer, so he told his daughter to wait patiently, to hold on and not fall asleep. After you finish your candy, I'll come back with help, he promised. Yin-Yang crawled out to find help, dragging his injured leg into a narrow alley. There wasn't a single light around, only the pale moonlight, illuminating the concrete road. Yin-Yang quickly found a lighting store at the end, and sought help from the shopkeeper inside, but the shopkeeper remained unmoved, saying that his daughter had to come on her own will for it to work. The more Yin-Yang heard, the more anxious he became, wondering how she could come if he couldn't even move. Angry, Yin-Yang grabbed a lamp, wanting to smash it, but his body was frozen in place, unable to move. The shopkeeper snatched the lamp from his hands, and Yin-Yang noticed something strange about himself. Through the glass, he couldn't help but ask the shopkeeper, "Where exactly is this place?"
어떻게 하셨죠?
In fact, Yin-Yang had already been crushed to death by the collapsing building, while his daughter still had a glimmer of hope for survival. But the girl had to find her own will, and discover the lamp that belonged to her to survive safely. But Yin-Yang's daughter was so small, and she was trapped under the stone, unable to move. He wanted to help his daughter, regardless of the cost.
정말 무슨 일이든 할 수 있습니까?
네.
거래를 하죠.
Thus, Yin-Yang took over for the shopkeeper, becoming the new ferryman. At this moment, the bulb representing the detective's vitality was flickering weakly, proving that he still had a chance to awaken. The detective couldn't help but ask, "Since I'm not dead yet, why are my eyes having problems? It's like I'm a ghost?" Yin-Yang explained that in the earthly realm, if the deceased wander around, it appears very strange, which is why they are called ghosts. In this world, it is exactly the opposite, as living people wandering around is what seems strange. That's why you look like a ghost. The detective urged Yin-Yang not to hide what kind of world this is, and why he wouldn't directly answer his questions. The moment Yin-Yang began to speak, the scene suddenly turned black and white. He said, "This is the afterlife world. People who are unable to live their entire lives, due to unfortunate accidents, will continue their lives in this place. People like the detective who are not yet dead, still have a chance to return to the normal world, but he should not perceive the anomalies of this world, because once he perceives it, he will remember. Those who want to go back cannot leave with memories of this place. Otherwise, the two worlds will become confused. The detective will be unable to distinguish between space and time, and Yin-Yang is the ferryman guarding the boundary." The scene shifts back to the normal world. In the intensive care unit of the hospital, a new nurse, Xiao Song, has been assigned, and Yang Ji, as a senior, is helping her get familiar with the job. One of the most important tasks is to understand the patient's conditions, whether it's their medical history or treatment status, and why the patients were admitted to the ICU. All the nurses here need to be familiar with this, so Yang Ji is taking Xiao Song to meet the patients. First, they meet the uncle with bangs who has been looking for his dog, who was the first patient admitted to the ICU. However, he was not a victim of the bus accident in the city, as there was another accident that day. The uncle with bangs is named Zhang Bingjin, and on the day of the incident, he got lost in the mountains and stumbled. With the sudden downpour, Zhang Bingjin fell into a coma due to the cold temperature. Fortunately, a rescue dog lay on him, helping to maintain his body temperature, which is why he didn't lose his vital signs. Those rescue dogs are rigorously trained, and once they find a search target, they won't leave. They only notify others by barking continuously. The rescue dog was struck by a branch. yet it didn't abandon its mission and leave. By the time the rescuers arrived, the rescue dog had already passed away. It entered the afterlife world together with the unconscious Jiang Bingjin. That's why Jiang Bingjin always feels cold, and he constantly hears the barking that others cannot hear, because the rescue dog was doing its utmost to save him. At this moment, Jiang Bingjin chased the dog into a dark alley. He finally saw that it was a rescue dog, and some vague memories began to awaken. Jiang Bingjin hugged it tightly, continuously apologizing, but the rescue dog barked a few times. It signaled for Jiang Bingjin to keep moving forward, and together they headed towards the lighting store. Yongji continued to introduce the next patient Hyunju to Xiaosong. She suffered a head injury from a car accident, resulting in a subdural hemorrhage. Although there were no visible external injuries, the mortality rate was very high. Xiaosong found it strange after hearing this, that such a severe fall accident could leave the patient with no external wounds at all. Yongji explained that on the day of the accident, Hyunju was with her mother, and it was likely that her mother fought desperately to protect her. Unfortunately, they couldn't avoid the impact of the fall, and Hyunju's mother Zhang Weishi had already died. She was to be buried the following morning. At this time, her soul remained by Hyunju's side, and every night she urged her daughter to buy light bulbs. She hoped that Hyunju would find her own lamp and awaken. In addition, Hui Yuan, who died protecting Shanhei, was also about to be prepared for burial. Fortunately, the two had already recognized each other in the afterlife. Though Shanhei was trapped in the house, she didn't feel scared at all. Hui Yuan asked her if she didn't think the house was dark, saying, "You can go out to buy a light bulb." Hui Yuan actually wanted Shanhei to awaken, but the latter replied that she couldn't open the password lock. Hui Yuan had to awaken the dreamer, saying, "The door is open. You can go out anytime."
문 밖을 나가면 골목 끝에 조명 가게가 있어.
On the other side, Yongji's introductions were still ongoing. When it was time for Ji Xiong, Xiaosong noticed a basketball under the bed, which was returned by the boy they had saved. Yongji placed the ball back under Ji Xiong's bed, hoping to cheer him on. Just as she finished speaking, a car accident patient emerged from a coma, and he was to be taken to the morgue on the third basement level. Although his face was covered with a white cloth, the dialogue between the morticians suggested the deceased was likely the bus driver, Mr. Wu. It was Xiaosong's first experience with such a situation, and she felt quite uncomfortable inside. Yongji comforted her, saying not to be sad, as many people never even made it to this place. We are the guardians of the boundary between life and death. We can only do our best.
그럼 이분들도 코마 끝나면
돌아오거나 그곳에 남거나.
Yongji believed that no matter which world they are in, they will find their final peace. At this moment, Mr. Wu had entered the dark alley, and a basketball rolled by. He chased after the ball and found Ji Xiong, recognizing that this was one of his passengers. So he bent down and carried Ji Xiong on his back. In fact, Mr. Wu had been searching for the wandering passengers, wanting to lead them to the lighting store. As a way to atone for the accident, Ji Xiong said that the place they had just encountered was also holding his sister, who seemed to be trapped in a house, unable to come out. Mr. Wu turned to take a look, and decided to first take Ji Xiong to the store. Meanwhile, the conversation between Yin-Yang and the detective was still ongoing. The detective said he could no longer hear the sound of the motorcycle. The noodle shop owner was just like Yin-Yang, and he also had a pair of golden vertical pupils. The detective had been following the sound of his motorcycle, which led him near the lighting store, and once he moved away from this place, the sound of the motorcycle would reappear. So it turns out that it was indeed the noodle shop owner who led him to the lighting store. Yin-Yang asked the detective, "So, do you still want to continue chasing him?"
만나서 확인할 게 있어서요.
가서 확인하시죠.
어디로? 어떻게 갑니까?
손님은 이미 빛을 찾지 않았습니까?
Hearing this, the detective flicked his lighter. "Yeah, I have found my own light." The moment the lighter lit up, the detective awakened from his hospital bed. While Jiang Bingjin followed the rescue dog to the store, he also found his light. Meanwhile, Mr. Wu carried Ji Xiong to the entrance of the store, urging him to quickly find his own light. From now on, everything would depend on Ji Xiong's will. Before leaving, Mr. Wu had one more thing he wanted to say.
미안하다. 이 말을 꼭 하고 싶었어.
Ji Xiong walked into the store under Mr. Wu's gaze, and he successfully found the light. Mr. Wu returned to the alley to save Shanhei, where he found the house Ji Xiong mentioned. He wanted to try to climb over the wall, but unexpectedly, Hui Yuan opened the window.
아저씨도 죽었어요. 나도 그래요.
죄송합니다.
Mr. Wu truly regretted it, knowing full well that there was a problem with the brakes, but he wanted to save on repair costs. If he had prioritized the lives of his passengers at that time, this tragedy would not have occurred.
아저씨 잘못 맞아요. 죄송하다 해주시니 다행이네요. 우리도 불행하고 아저씨도 불행하네요. 그렇다고 모든 불행을 떠안지는 말아요.
Mr. Wu explained that he wanted to find the living people and bring them to the lighting store. Hui Yuan remembered that when she was with Hyunju, the girl mentioned that she lived in the Wish Tower, so she told Mr. Wu to check there. As for Shanhei, Hui Yuan would personally take her to the store. Mr. Wu, supporting his weary body, arrived near the tower, and he happened to run into Hyunju's mother. The latter had cotton stuffed in her mouth and couldn't speak, and she could only gesture to guide Mr. Wu. Then, she went to the lighting store alone. She stuffed the necklace engraved with her daughter's name into Wan-Yang's hands. Wanting to take the light bulb for Hyunju, Wan-Yang explained that she had to come in person. Upon hearing this, Hyunju's mother sobbed and pleaded, and her emotions were about to spiral out of control. Wan-Yang had to take off her glasses, revealing her vertical pupils, and Hyunju's mother indeed quieted down upon seeing this. At this moment, she caught sight of the box where Wan-Yang kept candy wrappers, and she suddenly became very excited. Hyunju's mother gestured, though it was unclear what she wanted to convey. She unwrapped a piece of candy and stuffed it into Wan-Yang's mouth, and the familiar action and taste instantly reminded Wan-Yang of her daughter. It turned out that Zhang Weishi was the girl trapped under the rubble. Wan-Yang is willing to sacrifice her freedom to save her daughter. On the other side, Hyunju finally stopped sulking and walked out of her bedroom, but her mother was nowhere to be found. She was about to go out to look for her when Hyunju saw Mr. Wu at the apartment entrance. She had encountered too many strange things lately, and she wanted to pretend not to see him and leave directly. Mr. Wu suddenly spoke up. "I have something to convey on behalf of your mother. Can you let me finish?" Just as he finished speaking, Mr. Wu suddenly spat out, and Hyunju jumped in shock, wanting to seek help from a passerby, but the lady directly ignored her. Mr. Wu explained, "She can't see us. Think about it carefully. Once you realize the problem, you'll understand." Hyunju couldn't help but recall her teachers and classmates who could never hear her speak. Even the security guard by the roadside would ignore her greetings. At the moment Hyunju realized the problem, blood suddenly surged from her nostrils. Mr. Wu had reached his limit, and he couldn't personally take her to the lighting store. He urged Hyunju to say goodbye to her mother, and to go to the store to find the light bulb and leave this world. Hyunju returned to the apartment to wait for her mother to come home, and before long, her mother returned with the light bulb, but Hyunju didn't want to take it.
나 엄마랑 살면 안 돼. 나 엄마랑 같이 살래.
Zhang Weishi couldn't say a word, and she could only desperately stuff the light bulb into her daughter's arms. She still had a bright future and a father waiting outside. How could she stay in a place like this? The light bulb emitted a warm glow. Mr. Wu, seeing this scene, closed his eyes wearily. Meanwhile, Shanhei was also ready to leave the house, and walked out under Hui Yuan's watchful gaze. As soon as they were out of each other's sight, Shanhei's tears instantly gushed forth. She quickly reached the lighting store at the end of the alley, and recognized her own light bulb. The hospital nurse noticed signs of awakening in Shanhei, and hurriedly called the attending physician. But Shanhei had already made her decision, and she smashed the lamp, wanting to stay and accompany Hui Yuan. No matter which world they lived in, two people are always better than one. Wherever Hui Yuan was, that was Shanhei's home. The ICU nurse was very frustrated, as Shanhei was clearly about to regain consciousness. Why did she suddenly die? Yongji comforted her. Perhaps it was a moment of light before death. The deceased must have seen the light at that moment. At the same time, the morticians still couldn't open the cold storage, where the body was kept. They could wait no longer. Even if they had to break the cold storage door, they needed to quickly prepare the deceased for burial. It had already taken too long for the deceased. Ji-Yong brought Ah-Jun back to the scene of the incident, once again stitching up his broken waist. But Ji-Yong no longer had time. The next day, she stepped into the middle of the road to stop a bus. Then Ji-Yong walked straight to Ah-Jun inside the bus, demanding to know why he couldn't remember her.
나 사랑하긴 했어? 나 사랑하긴 했냐고!
When the bus arrived at the station, everyone else was getting ready to disembark, but not a single person looked their way. Ah-Jun was very confused, and Ji-Yong cried, "They can't see us." After saying this, she tore open Ah-Jun's shirt, revealing the black stitches. She desperately questioned, "When will you remember?" After seeing the wound, he finally realized that something was wrong with this world. Then memories returned to him, and the two returned together to Ji-Young's studio, although they had just recognized each other. It was already time to part ways. Ji-young instructed Ah-jun to go to the lighting store and tell the owner that you need something. Then look for the light bulb that glows when you approach it. Only then can you awaken. The two parted ways at the end of the alley, and Ah-jun walked alone toward the lighting store. Yin-Yang reminded him not to touch anything randomly, but Ah-jun began to fumble around the store carelessly.
아무거나 손대지 말라고 했습니다. 당신의 의지가 아니군요.
Just as she finished speaking, Ah-jun discovered a faint light. By the time Ji-young saw the warm light and ran over, Ah-jun had already vanished from the room. She could only turn around and return to the dark alley. Ah-jun's condition seemed different from the other comatose patients, which should be a clue laid down by the director. Time quickly moved forward to 3 months later. Ji-seong was fully recovered and ready to be discharged. His delirium symptoms were also about to improve, though he occasionally confused where he was. Yeonji came over to give Ji-seong a discharge gift, and this silly boy said something about seeing each other next time. Yeonji told him not to talk nonsense. What meeting? Do you want to get hurt again? From now on, we should not meet again. Ji-seong felt inexplicably that this phrase was familiar, as if someone had said it to him before.
그 아저씨가 세상 무뚝뚝한데 은근 따뜻하지.
What Yeonji said was likely what Mr. Wu had said, and now he continued his work in another world. Meanwhile, Shanhei had been living with Hui Yuan, and Hyunju was slowly recovering with her father's companionship. She intentionally didn't accept treatment for her delirium, in order to remember her mother. Fortunately, Aunt Weishi was not alone, as she had found her father. She also adopted the rescue dog, Max, and the three of them guarded the lighting store, guiding the wandering and lost souls. But the story does not end here. Do you remember the unsolved case photo, posted on the detective's desk? The missing victim Park Shan-yu has come before Hyunju. They had met in the afterlife, and Shan-yu had no friends wherever she went, except for Hyunju, who had greeted her.
근데 네가 떠나고 난 다시 혼자가 됐어. 그래서 널 따라왔어. 나랑 친구 해줄래?
As the scene shifted, the detective arrived at the noodle shop, and met with the owner Kim Sang-hoon. He had already learned the details from the doctor that a car accident occurred while he was pursuing Kim Sang-hoon. In a critical moment, Sang-hoon instinctively shielded him, but he was struck and killed by a truck. Fortunately, the detective had the ability to see spirits, so he could still see Sang-hoon's soul. Thus, he specifically came to the noodle shop to thank him. Kim Sang-hoon replied that there was no need to thank him. I was just doing my job. In fact, Sang-hoon was also a guide, which is why he had cat-like eyes. His job was to escort those who couldn't remain in the living world to the afterlife. That was why he pursued the woman who died in the fire. As for the elderly man living alone, it was simply because no one cared for him, and he couldn't go out due to his mobility issues. He was close to starving. Kim Sang-hoon wanted to feed the old man a bowl of zajjiangmyeon before he died, which is why the detective noticed something was wrong. Now, Sang-hoon had to leave this world, but there was no one to take his place as a guide. The detective was not only observant, but he also had the ability to see ghosts, making him the best candidate to be the new guide. Kim Sang-hoon asked if he was willing to accept this job, and since the detective was best at handling unsolved cases, he would naturally not decline this good opportunity. He took the sunglasses and left the noodle shop, only to find that he had work to do right after taking the position. Do you remember the day of the bus accident, when a man with chest pain sought Yeongji's help? Due to the high number of casualties and a shortage of personnel, Yeongji couldn't attend to him. As a result, the man harbored resentment after his death, and he came back specifically to seek revenge on Yeongji. In a critical moment, the detective arrived just in time, and he was responsible for taking the man back to the afterlife. On the other side, unlike the other patients who had returned to normal, Ah-jun's delirium symptoms were becoming more severe. Moreover, others said that his girlfriend had died, but Ah-jun couldn't remember anyone named Ji-young at all. The doctor suggested that he organize his environment. Since you don't want to remember painful things, then let go of unnecessary items and people. Forget everything and start anew. After leaving the hospital, he wheeled himself to the accident scene. He took out his phone that contained Ji-young's messages, and he made up his mind to throw it into the sea. Ah-jun decided to look forward from now on. 3 months ago, when the mortician was preparing Ji-young's remains, the woman couldn't help but ask, "Why did he forget me?" Others, even in that place, still remembered each other. Does that mean he doesn't love me? The mortician was about to trim the deceased's nails, when he noticed that even in this world, Ji-young's nails were still growing from her fingertips. She was different from the other deceased, as her regrets and obsessions had not dissipated. That night, when Ah-jun returned home, the lights in the hallway suddenly went out. He waved his hand, trying to get the smart light to turn back on.
다시 기억하고 불러줬으면 좋겠어요.
The hallway lights flickered on one by one, and Ji-young appeared again by Ah-jun's side, just as she had texted before her death. I will go to the place where you are. In the post-credits scene, the detective returned to the police station and placed Shun-yu's photo and file into a drawer. He then began investigating the collapse of the high school building, which was the school of the youth group and supernatural squad. In the evening, the detective arrived in front of that building, where he encountered the time-stopping superpower user Kim Young-jak. This could be considered as a linkage of the Jiangchao universe. The story for this season comes to an end here. Overall, it is a relatively excellent adaptation. The subplots may seem a bit chaotic, which makes the storyline appear disjointed. However, Junsao's original manga also features this kind of multi-threaded ensemble, culminating in a cohesive narrative at the end. The horror atmosphere in the first 4 episodes was very well crafted, aligning perfectly with the aesthetics of Asian horror films. The last 4 episodes transitioned into a more lyrical narrative, revealing that beneath the terrifying and strange exterior, there lies a warm and sorrowful core: family, love, guilt, and loyalty. Each subplot has its own significance. This is probably the secret to Junsao's success. If you enjoy my channel, please click subscribe.